Yeah, I stand on all existing protocols. Um, as my learned friends would advise, prejudice to the ownership of the exchange. I think I just wanted to highlight on two key areas. One is basically what the CEO of the stock exchange had quite nicely put, which are the advantages of the demutualization. Of course, I think if I have paid attention to the presentation, there are two driving forces that's making us do that, or making the exchange look at this. One is the fact that globalization, or the trend, as the millennials would say, is that of demutualizing. The second being technology. Technology brings with it all kinds of interesting things. Of course, the major driver of technology is disruption. It can actually create competitors to the exchange, and therefore the exchange ought to be ahead of the curve, so to speak. So the advantages have been highlighted. One is that of governance. Two is that of investors coming in and playing a role within that governance structure, and also allowing flexibility for the exchange itself in accessing the global markets, and greater access to resources in terms of raising capital, etc., if it were to go the full hog after the demutualization, if it gets listed itself. Then, of course, obviously what Ike had mentioned, which are the conflicts. And I would highlight just three key areas of conflict. One is in listing and listing rules and regulations. Two is in regulatory market operations. And three, which not many people mention, is that of business continuity planning. Of course, with the listing, if it is the exchange that's going to get listed, now who is going to then regulate its listing requirements? Two, as a profit-motivated entity, the listing requirements may either be too strict, too high, or too low. If I am on the other side and pushing the exchange to make as much listing fees as possible, I'd say bring the bar down. But if the exchange is looking at world-class, etc., it wants the bar to be higher. So there is that conflict that we should pay attention to, or the exchange ought to look at, in the after the demutualization process, as well as the shareholders after that, right? So it's not just about making money sometimes, it's about sustainability of the entity, right? In terms of market operations regulations, it's again similar conflict in nature. So if I go to the business continuity aspect, we do business continuity because it's a requirement, one. Two, it is something that you ought to do to continue to run the business, but it comes with costs. Now, if you're a profit-motivated entity, you're looking at that, and you're also looking at the returns you would get in that investment. So is it for public good, the greater good of public, or is it the profit motive in terms of looking and cutting costs and so on and so forth? So those three areas of conflict need to be looked at and be able to be put into consideration upon the demutualization process. Thank you.
Thank you very much for an insider's view of some of the issues that are to be raised. May I ask Bolaji now to give us his views? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. May I please stand on the existing protocols? I do think it's important to put in the correct, context and perspective some of the points that have been made earlier. Otherwise, we run the risk of a process which, is one of some complexity ordinarily, which should be, quite simplified in execution. We run the risk that a process which ordinarily should be quite simple and straightforward in execution actually becomes, a substantially complex process. I think there are a number of things which are not in doubt. The first is that, whether the exchange has share capital or not, the exchange has members. And the members of that exchange, de facto, de jure, basically are the owners of the beneficial rights, or the owners of the trading rights, or the owners of all of the rights that can be attributed to what you might describe as beneficial ownership in the exchange. That is established, in fact, it's established in all that we have seen in the due diligence. Some of these owners actually joined by payment of money or consideration, and the fact that the overarching Company Act of a country changed some 40 years after they joined this entity as members does not cease to make them members. So I would expect that first and foremost, when the exchange makes available its register of members, it will be very, very clear who those members are. The exchange's constitution is also very, very clear that it has two types of members. It clarifies them as dealing and ordinary members. Global precedent on these matters is also extremely clear and well established. In fact, in over 95% of the jurisdictions in which demutualizations have occurred, the members of the exchange are the dealing members. Nigeria is one of those unique situations where, aside from the dealing members, you also have ordinary members, and global precedent is extremely well established again, that those members are the beneficial owners of the exchange. Having said that, I think there are a number of things that are also becoming increasingly clear. And one of those is that, in order to ensure that this process is well established in law, it would be, or it may be desirable to pursue legislation. And there are broadly, 3 or 4 options for legislation. I disagree with the utilization that's been raised of the, omnibus clauses, of CAMA, because I think, it could be argued that there is, some weakness in that, and I'm also not sure that we have established precedents, of that particular section having been utilized previously. But certainly, the options are either to go by way of a Demutualization Act, which again, has some established precedents. It may be by way of an amendment of Section 26 of CAMA. But there are also fantastic precedents globally, for legislation that goes by way of excluding the stock exchange from, specific provisions of the Companies Act. This is legislation that a number of jurisdictions have used, typically under the support of the financial leader, the political financial leadership of the market, on the basis that they're extenuating circumstances and on the basis of public interest. And I think, that one of these options clearly is open to us, legislative-wise, and I know that there is no, shortage of extremely clever legal capacity in this country that is familiar, with legislative, processes, and I have no doubt that, with what one of the panelists has described as extremely clever financial engineering, almost anything is possible. In fact, I'm very delighted to see, two masters of that art. Dr. Konya Ajayi seated in the audience, Dr. Timi Austin Peters, our moderator. And I'm sure that at various points in time, we will pull all of them into the argument and the conversation around how we move forward. What is, however, clear is that if you demutualize and you don't take into consideration all of the stakeholders who have helped, to build this exchange, you would have created, for me, potentially an unfair process. And what I would expect to see is that, and it's important that everybody understands that there are several processes in this demutualization. At the first stage, the only people who can be beneficiaries would be the members of record today. In other words, the dealing and the ordinary members. But by the time that the exchange is fully demutualized and listed on the NSC, if, for example, you didn't see provisions, for example, for the wider Nigerian, stakeholder orbit, including, investors on the market, for example, to have the opportunity of participating in this process, then, to a large extent, we wouldn't have carried along everybody. And I think in order for the process to stick, in order for the process to be sustainable, that is almost essential. What is not in doubt is that demutualization is extremely desirable. It's also very, very important to recognize that if we're going to develop this country very properly, and if we're going to diversify this economy, then we're going to go back, to something for me which, we talk about, in the course of everything, but we all fail to focus on it, which is very fundamentally that the only way you develop a country properly is by developing its infrastructure. And what is pretty clear, is that, with the advent, of banking regulations like Basel III, banks will become, less and less relevant in financing infrastructure, not only, globally, as they already are becoming, but also more importantly in countries like Nigeria. And the capital markets will become extremely important and potentially the principal tool for channeling large pools of capital like the pension monies that we have seen into infrastructure financing and investment. And whether we like it or not, we are going to have to ensure that we develop these capital markets in order to develop this economy properly.